The Hellenists, the world of Alexander the Great. The rise of Macedonia. Philip II of Macedonia reigned from 359 through 336 BC. Without the military and political efforts of Philip, Alexander would never have been as successful as he was. Philip's work with the Macedonian army and establishment of alliances with the Balkan region gave both himself and Alexander the resources necessary to carry out such conquest. Innovations that helped make the Macedonian the power that it was in the time of his assassination in 336 BC. First, he increased the size of the group of royal companions, that is, the cavalry, the hetatori, giving more people influential positions and more of a sense of belonging to the kingdom. He is also credited with beginning the practice of allowing the sons of nobles to receive education in the court of the king. Here, the sons would not only develop a fierce loyalty for the king, but it was also a way for Philip, in a sense, to hold the children hostage, to keep the parents from interfering with his authority. At the Battle of Coronea in August of 338 BC, Philip's army was greatly outnumbered by the Athenians and Theban forces, yet his phalanxes successfully overwhelmed them. Both cities were forced to become subjects of Philip and Macedonia, leaving Sparta as the only Greek state not under Macedonian control. In the Council of Corinth the next year, Philip outlined a system for ruling the Greek states. He gave freedom and autonomy to the political parties in each state, yet established a network of bureaucracies that would be stable and loyal to him. Then, with the support of all Greece, Philip declared war on Persia to retaliate for the Persian invasions of Greece several generations before. His assassination. Philip, attending a banquet in his honor, is assassinated by Pausanias. Alexander is immediately crowned king at the age of 20. Attacks the Persian Empire. The battle between Alexander the Great and the armies of the Persian Empire at the Granicus River in Asia Minor. When Alexander started his war against the Persians in the spring of 334 BC, he is met at the Granicus by an army of Persian soldiers and Greek hoplites. The Persian force stationed itself at the top of a steep bank on the opposite side of the river. The Persian plan was to concentrate their attack upon Alexander in the hope he might be killed. But Alexander led a successful charge across the river and routed them. According to tradition, Alexander lost only 110 soldiers. After the Battle of Granicus, all the states of Asia Minor submitted to Alexander the Great. Alexander had liberated the Ionian Greeks from the Persians. The Gordian knot. The Gordian knot was the name given to an intricate knot tied to an ox cart. An oracle foretold that he who would untie the knot would rule all of Asia. Alexander arrives at the town of Gordium. As Alexander climbs the hill and approaches the knot, his generals warn the young man not to attempt it. The town of Gordium gathered to watch this young Macedonian. Would he be able to accomplish the task? Seeing the knot, Alexander said, "It doesn't matter how the knot is untied," and drew out his sword, and in one slash severed the knot. This gives us an insight of Alexander, that when he approaches the problem, he finds a simple solution. Other accounts claim that he just pulled the linchpin to loosen the knot and then untied it.
The Battle of Issus. The engagement fought in 333 BC, Alexander the Great and Persian king Darius III during Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire. After invading northern Syria, Alexander left his wounded soldiers in a camp in the city of Issus, directing the remainder of his army southward in search of Darius's armies. Meanwhile, Darius moved his army up the south. In a maze of Syrian mountains, the two armies passed each other. Darius discovered Alexander's camp at Issus and massacred the wounded Macedonian soldiers. After Alexander found himself cut off from communications with the north, he returned to Issus and defeated Darius's army. Darius fled to Babylonia. From this battleground, Alexander headed south and in turn subjugated Tyre, Gaza, Egypt, Syria, and Palestine by 332 BC. This great mosaic from the Roman city of Pompeii that was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius depicts the Battle of Issus. And here what we get to see is very simple. The one that was from the previous. There is Alexander looking towards Darius. Darius is in this area on his chariot, and you can see almost the fear in his eyes. And this is when he had fled from the battle. The conquest of Tyre, Gaza, and Egypt. One of the things we have to remember about Alexander is his ability to read the ground, topography, and how to use it to his advantage. This was part of his genius and why he would win so many battles. At Tyre, it would be the longest battle he ever fought and lasted 7 months because Tyre was basically on an island. And it took 7 months to basically build a land bridge. Alexander saw there's no way that they could escape from the island. So by building the land bridge, they were able to get to Tyre and then subjugate it. While in Egypt, Alexander was given the titles of Pharaoh of Egypt and the son of Ammon, which served to reinforce his divine absolutism. Furthermore, during this same time frame, while in Egypt, Alexander established a first city, which appropriately named Alexandria. This was the beginning of creation of some 70 more Alexandrias in the Orient, as well as several military settlement bases, used to oversee and defend his conquered territories. The Battle of Gaugamela. The armies of Alexander and the Persian monarch Darius fought in 331 BC. The Persian defeat opened the east to the Macedonians. Alexander, with 37,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, invaded Persia from Egypt. The Persian army assembled about 250,000 men on the plain of Gaugamela, which is now Iraq. Alexander attacked the Persian left flank and then broke through the center. Darius fled, and the Persians retreated. The Persians lost tens of thousands of men in battle, and the Macedonians lost fewer than 500. Persepolis, 330 BC. In the summer of 330 BC, Alexander advanced north from Persepolis toward Ecbatana. To avoid being killed or captured, Darius fled before Alexander's army in the direction of the Caspian Sea and Bactria. And it was during this phase of the military operations that he was murdered by his own nobles before the Greeks could overtake him. Alexander now claimed the total Persian Empire. Notwithstanding his military victories, Alexander was now forced into several years of guerrilla warfare in remote regions of this new empire. Eventually, Bessus, the Persian noble who had murdered Darius, was captured, mutilated, and executed in 328. A few months later, the last Persian leader was also murdered by his own men and his head sent to Alexander. The conquest of Persia had been accomplished. Alexander would then go on and try to solidify his political bonds by marrying Roxanne, a Bactria, and then also married Statiria, the daughter of Darius. Alexander in India. Alexander also had a romantic desire to reach the ends of the earth, which Greek geographers taught was a short distance beyond the Indus River. For the next 3 years, he moved east to Pakistan, and by 327 BC had reached India. He would enter India and be encountering some of the toughest fighting of his career in the crossing. None of the Greeks had ever encountered anything to prepare them for India. The terrain, the monsoons, the fierce tribes, all combined with long years of campaigning had taken some of the heart out of the Macedonians. By the spring of 326 BC, Alexander crossed the river Kofan and entered Taxlia. King Taxils equipped him with troops in return for aid against his rival Porus, who ruled the lands between Hydaspes and the Asinius rivers in India. In June 326 BC, Alexander fought his last great battle on the left bank of Hydaspes against Porus, one of the most powerful Indian kings. Porus was powerful both as a man and as a king, and he stood 7 feet tall, a widely feared ruler and warrior. He fielded an army that was a match for the Greeks, but Porus' army had an additional advantage: war elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes River. This marked the first real encounter with elephants in battle, and it terrified the Greeks. Worse yet, Alexander met Porus during the monsoon season and faced him across a river in flood. Alexander's army crossed the heavily defended river Hydaspes in dramatic fashion during a violent thunderstorm to meet Porus's force. Porus set up 200 war elephants, 100 feet apart, in the space between the elephants, but a little behind them. He placed his infantry. The elephants were key because the horses in Alexander's cavalry were afraid of them. Alexander realized that he had to attack some area other than the elephants, so he decided to go after the enemy's cavalry and ordered his phalanx not to attack until his cavalry had sent Porus' army into disarray. This is another advantage that Alexander had and through all his campaigns. His armies were very disciplined and they trusted one another, even though they couldn't see one another on the battlefield. They were assured that their comrades would get the job done. The enemy's cavalry was surrounded and fled behind the elephants. Alexander's phalanx now advanced and were charged by the elephants, which stopped the phalanx in its tracks. Eventually, Alexander's light infantry gained the upper hand as the elephants were stripped of their mahots, or hamstrung, by axes. The Greek phalanx in locked shield formation advanced slowly in a solid wall of pikes, causing the elephants to stampede and run over their own Indian infantry. The Indian army broke and fled. Some 80 elephants were captured, and many Indians were killed in the pursuit. The battle had raged for 8 hours, and the Macedonians suffered many casualties themselves. More than any other campaign, Alexander captured Porus, who had been wounded in battle, and like the other rulers he had defeated, allowed him to continue governing his territory as his vassal. He even subdued an independent province and granted it to Porus as a gift. In this battle, Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, was wounded and died. Alexander had ridden Bucephalus in every one of his battles in Greece and Asia, so when it died, he was grief-stricken and founded a city in India in his horse's name. Having secured the upper Indus River Valley, Alexander began to push into the interior of India, where the kingdoms and the cities were formidable and appeared to be endless. At last, his men refused to go any further, and Alexander finally gave the order to return to Persia. The Gedrosian Desert. In 324 BC, Alexander decided to march his army through the barren wasteland of Gedrosian Desert in present-day Iran. Some say he could have made this trip easily by sailing his troops through the Persian Gulf instead, but he decided to go through the desert as a challenge because no one had ever successfully brought an army through it. According to Plutarch, the waterless desert, along with starvation, claimed the lives of almost 3/4 of Alexander's troops. It is no wonder that once the Macedonian remnant reached supplies in Carmania, they said to have spent the rest of their journey in a state of ecstatic joy and revelry reminiscent of dynastic procession. Alexander's happiness was, however, tempered by reports that his governors had mismanaged the territories that he had placed under their control. These he executed for crimes against their subjects. Many had believed that he would not survive the Gregorian desert to bring them into account. And one tale said that when they were crossing the desert, they had to kill their horses and drink their blood in order to try to get any kind of water. And that his men collected enough water and put it into a helmet to give to the Macedonian king. When they presented it to Alexander, he dumped it on the ground and refused to drink it. Further, to do this in order to instill the will of their men to continuing, that he saw them as their equal. So this map depicts Alexander's routes, starting in Pella in Macedonia, crossing over towards the Aegean, and then making his way all the way back down towards Egypt, and then to Gaugamela, Persepolis, the capital of Persia, and all the way to India. The death of Alexander, 323. By 324 BC, he arrived in Babylon, where he rested his troops and prepared plans for the future. Although some historians maintain that he originally planned to go west to Gibraltar, Alexander did in fact decide to first circumnavigate Arabia in order to open trade between Babylon and Egypt. Just as he and his forces were about to sail, not long after the incident with Cledius, Alexander fell ill with a fever and died on June 10, 323. Alexander was just 33 years old. When asked on his deathbed who was to be his successor, he is said to reply, "To the strongest." His illness had been verily ascribed to malaria or typhus, aided by exhaustion and poorly healed wounds. In antiquity, another school of thought held that the young king was poisoned by Antipater, through the agency of his son Cassander, fearing the loss of his position in Macedonia, leaving behind his wife Roxanne and his unborn son. When Alexander died, he left no legitimate heirs. His wife Roxanne was expecting a child, which would have required a long regency. His next nearest relative was a feeble-minded half-brother who would have also have needed a regent. Not surprising, therefore, the principal arguments among the leadership was the appointment of a regent. Disorder ensued, and within a few years, Roxanne and her son, Alexander IV, were put to death, and the highest-ranking generals proceeded to divide the empire amongst themselves. According to legend, his body was placed in a gold coffin and carried to Memphis, Egypt, and later taken to Alexandria and placed in a beautiful tomb. However, this tomb has never been found. Alexander's legacy. The death of Alexander marked the beginning of a new stage in Greek history. The Hellenic civilization was replaced by the Hellenistic, and the fusion of culture and the intermingling of peoples, resulting from Alexander's conquest. Gradually, a new pattern of civilization emerged, based on the mixture of Greek and Oriental elements. The Hellenistic culture spoke Greek and had despotic governments, leaned towards extravagance and art and love of luxury. It consisted of an economic system that featured state-controlled big business, with ruthless competition, and in philosophy a defeatism that resulted in the loss of logic and the power of mind of religions based on faith. Greek language, architecture, and literature spread to the Near East. They were able to establish 70 military colonies, or cities, bearing the name Alexandria, settled by Greek mercenaries. So let's turn to one of those Hellenistic cities, a city which exhibited this new tolerance for women, and a city which also contained many of the new economic social advantages of the new era, Alexandria. Alexandria perhaps is the best example of a Hellenistic city that is cosmopolitan population, thousands of shops and bazaars, public buildings, including Greek temples, a museum for scientific study, a library, the largest in ancient times, tombs, an arsenal, a royal palace, and administrative buildings, storehouses, a courthouse, extensive parks, and many gymnasiums. And outside the city gates, there was a stadium, a hippodrome, amphitheater, and a necropolis, or city of the dead. Here was the true Hellenistic city, with Greek Ptolemies, administrators, and soldiers and ambassadors. The world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, we'll look at the four kingdoms that were divided. The younger commanders had disagreed with these power-grabbing generals, and a series of wars followed, culminating in the decisive battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. The result of this battle led to the following divisions of the empire. Antigonus. Gontus succeeded and established the Antigonid dynasty. They would fall eventually to the Romans. The second one, General Seleucus, took possession of Persia, Mesopotamia, and Syria, the Seleucid kingdom. The Indian ruler Chandragupta Maurya drove the Seleucids out of India. His grandson, Osaka, a Buddhist, looked to convert the Greeks, and trade continued between the two kingdoms. The Attalid dynasty assumed control over Asia Minor and Thrace and sought to aid the Romans against the Antagonids and then the Seleucids. This led to the Romans' defeat of Antiochus III in 191 BC. And the last, and probably the greatest, was the Ptolemies. King since 305 BC added Phoenicia and Palestine to his original domain of Egypt. This lasted the longest until the reign of Cleopatra VII in 30 BC. So in reality, Cleopatra was not Egyptian, she was Greek. And so as we see in this map that depicts the world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, of the Seleucid monarchy, which was the largest of all the kingdoms, where you can see they were in India. Then you also had the other ones as well, but the greatest one, which had to be the Ptolemies, we see in Egypt and in part of Palestine as well. And there's Alexandria, the famous city. You probably briefly heard me talk about the Mauryan Empire under Osaka of India, who pushed the Seleucid kingdoms out of India and back into Iran. The Celts, also known as Gauls, were from Europe, north of the Alps, who attacked Rome and Macedonia and sacked Rome in 390 BC. Bryennius would also attack Macedonia in 278 BC, and the Celts and the Gauls attacked and then invaded Asia Minor in 230 BC. Attalus I would defeat the Celts and declare himself king of Pergamon. The Hellenistic monarchies. Hellenistic monarchs relied heavily on Greek and Macedonians to form their new social class. The Seleucid kingdom was only 2.5% of the people in authority were non-Greeks, most of them being military commanders. The Greeks wanted to maintain the ruling position, and non-Greeks had to essentially become Hellenized. Warfare was an important part of the Hellenistic kings. The phalanx, the heavily armed infantry, was now equipped with spears 18 feet long. The cavalry still formed its core. War elephants were used by the Seleucids from India and the Ptolemies from North Africa. Siege machines like catapults and siege towers were also introduced as well. Hellenistic cities. Alexander had found over 70 Alexandrias as new cities or military settlements. The military settlements to be manned by a few hundred men, but others by thousands of inhabitants. Alexandria in Egypt was the largest on the Mediterranean coast, and many Greek and Macedonians migrated to these new cities for the opportunity that it provided. These migrations would continue until 250 BC, and these cities were modeled after the mainland polis, or councils, magistrates, assemblies, and the code of laws. Each city was designed in rectangular square grids with temples, altars, and theaters, and each city was dominated by the Greek culture, literature, sculpture, and architecture. For Easterners to enter the ruling ranks, they would have to forego their culture and become Hellenized. These cities were islands of Greek culture and a sea of non-Greeks, and kings used these cities to keep control of their territory. The cities spread Greek culture as far as Afghanistan and India. The Aetolian League, or the Greek mainland, and the Achaean League and Peloponnesus. Some of the Greek states rebelled against Macedonian rule and formed alliances called the Achaean League and the Aetolian League. Basically, these states formed governments or confederacies with a central authority dependent on local powers. In order to generate revenue, the troops, similar to the American Articles of Confederation, the chief significant here is that there was only time that the Greeks approached a voluntary national union. By banding together in the structure, the Greeks were able to maintain their independence for nearly a century. Finally, between 146 and 30 BC, nearly all the Hellenistic territory came under Roman rule. Economic trends. Agriculture was in a few hands. The king would give it to his favorites and lease the rest to tenants for additional royal income, later to become hereditary serfs. Cheap labor, primarily was agrarian, migrated to the cities to escape serfdom and participate in the emerging economy. The cost of living increased and wages declined. The increase of labor forces, coupled with the Stoic philosophy of importance of the individual, declined in slavery. And industry spread east were promoted and regulated by the state and became governmental-owned and operated enterprises. The government tried to control the few remaining private ventures by fixing prices and manipulating the market for the benefit of the crown. Taxes were high, yet profits were 20 to 30% for merchants and the government. Commerce and trade, international money systems, gold and silver coins, banks developed to issue a credit and low interest rates. Hellenistic society. As we turn to the social aspects of these cities, we observe a distinct change of attitude towards females by the Hellenistic Greeks, as exemplified by the emergence of the new opportunities for the upper-class women. Women began to take an active role in politics. For example, Antony and Cleopatra. They mingled with men, moved freely in the streets, and contributed to literature, science, art, and general scholarship. For example, Aristodama of Samira gave recitals of her poetry throughout Greece and received many honors. Some philosophers, like Epicurus, even allowed women into their schools. Literature began to speak of romantic love and physical attractiveness of women, and not just her worth as a mother. In Macedonia, an alliance between mothers and their sons provided openings for women to take a more active role in politics. Opportunities for royal women in Egypt were greater. Arsinoe's wife and sister of Ptolemy II expanded the navy and was worshipped as a god. Her portrait was the first to appear on a coin with her husband. Hellenistic queens also wrote poems, collected art, and corresponded with intellectuals. The greatest gain for upper-class women were economics. Spartan women did not need men to satisfy legal requirements like owning land, and they owned 40% of the land in Sparta. Their Athenian counterparts, however, were still under strict supervision. Politically, women became magistrates for the cities. However, all these rights were for the upper class. Families were still small and boys were preferred. Girls were sold into slavery or abandoned. The role of slavery. Slaves were a large part of the Hellenistic world. Most consisted of displaced persons. Slaves came from the children of slaves, sold or abandoned by their parents. Pirates and raids, but a large majority came as prisoners of war. Slaves were either privately owned or worked for the government. Government-owned slaves worked as servants or officials or in government-controlled industries like weaving. Privately owned slaves worked as domestics, farmers, or in mining. Slaves that were Macedonian or Italian fetched higher prices, and women were sold also as concubines or soldiers. The transformation of education. The curriculum centered on music, physical exercise, and literature, especially Homer. The gymnasiarch served as the head of the gymnasium and was considered a prestigious position. Significant to the diffusion of Greek culture throughout the Hellenistic world, this was sponsored by the kings, but almost usually only those of the upper-class male children were allowed to attend the gymnasium. Culture in the Hellenistic world. First, we're going to look at literature. It is the patronage of Hellenistic monarchs, especially in Alexandria, and their subsidizing of literary men and artists that gradually brought about the disappearance of the classic Greek heritage and the creation of the Hellenistic. The Hellenistic literature was given more to literary copying and production than the creation of masterpieces. Most writing exhibited little originality or depth of thought. Why was this the case? Well, literature was light and was intended to amuse rather than instruct. It was during this time that Athens developed the so-called New Comedy, with Menander composing more than 100 plays. And in these plays, the old standards of conduct are laughed at, and the preoccupation with the seamy side of life, rather than the political or intellectual side, was predominant. Instead, the dominant theme, which seemed trivial compared to the lessons of Aristophanes, was romantic love and its pains and its pleasures. Theocritus. The Sicilian poet Theocritus chose as his poetic theme the idealization of nature, and particularly the countryside of Sicily, while residing in the hot, dusty city of Alexandria. This was a new theme for the Greeks, because in earlier times nature was associated with goddesses and not personal kinship. Theocritus described the lives of the Sicilian shepherds in his work and thus established a type of pastoral poetry. He wrote mimes, brief skits in which one or several actors mimic characters of everyday life. The field of Hellenistic prose literature was dominated by historians, his biographers, and the authors of utopias. Historical writing became very popular, especially biography, in particular the biography of Alexander the Great. Most biographies of this period were light and gossipy character. One of the first Hellenistic historians was Polybius, who wrote about the rise of Rome using the historical methods of eyewitness accounts as sources and investigating and checking the sources for accuracy. Many of today's historians rate him second only to Thucydides. Finally, there are the utopias, or the descriptive accounts of ideal states. Mostly all of these utopias depicted a life of social and economic equality, free from greed, strife, and oppression. It is probably fair to say that the popularities of these utopias was due to the injustices of Hellenistic society and the need for reform. Sculpture and architecture. In Hellenistic times, statuary was more abundant than any other earlier area. Statues enhanced palaces, homes, temples, parks, and city streets. Subjects were taken from every phase of human life and from plants and animals. Portrait busts of heroes and celebrities of Hellenistic period were found in abundance. Hellenistic art replaced the classic Greek humanism, depicting balance and restraint, with an exaggerated realism like you see here of the old market woman, also featuring voluptuous exaggeration of muscular and sensationalism. The famous Hellenistic artists also used bronze as another medium of expression. At Pergamon, Greek sculptors cast in bronze several battle scenes from the repulsion of the Gauls by Attalus. Marble copies were presented to Athens by Attalus for the use on the Acropolis. Fragments of these marble copies have survived to date, such as Gaul and his wife, as you can see on slide 20. As it exhibited in these representative works of art, there's a tendency in Hellenistic sculpture to reflect exaggerance, a theatrical manner, and in some measure of sentimentality. Violent emotionalism, sordid realism, heroic figures, naturalism, and individualism were all featured common to the majority of Hellenistic sculptures. In addition to marble and bronze, materials were used by artists for these sculptures varied from terracotta, crystal, topaz, basalt, and glass. The use of live models was quite common since Hellenistic artists reveled in the presenting the subjects anatomically correct from all perspectives of the human form. Despite the tendency for Hellenistic art to be somewhat bombastic, some sculpture was calm, poise, and compassion, as exemplified in the Eurydice of Melos, or the Venus de Milo, and the Winged Victory of Salmars. In architecture, the simple Doric structures of the classical period gave way to luxurious palaces and elaborate public buildings and monuments which were thought to exemplify the power and wealth of the age. The Hellenistic structures incorporated the more ornamental Corinthian columns and their elaborate capitals decorated with acanthus leaves. Here we see an example of an Hellenistic sculpture of the dying Gaul, as the Gaul soldier is seeing the last part of his life easing out. Though you wouldn't be able to see it because of the side, he has a gashed wound on the right side of his abdomen. Lacan and his sons on the right, from the Titus Palace in Rome, a first century marble. Lacan was the Trojan priest who warned the Trojans not to accept the wooden horse of Troy, with the famous words, according to Virgil, "I fear the Greeks, even when they're bearing Greek gifts." To punish him for his warning, Athena, who favored the Greeks, seized his two sons and told two servants to kill Lacan when he came into his son's aid. All three were crushed and died from the venom as portrayed by the sculpture. It's masterful in design and technique in its portrayal of the pain and agony, and was constructed from just two large blocks of marble. Nike alighting on a warship, or Nike Asomrits, in 190 BC, will be found in the Louvre of Paris. The Golden Age of Science and Medicine. The most brilliant age in the history of science prior to the 17th century AD was the period of Hellenistic civilization. Briefly stated, the reasons for this phenomenal development of science were Alexander, who before his death had provided some financial encouragement. 2, the fusion of Chaldean, Egyptian, and Greek scientific learning provided an intellectual stimulus. And 3, the new interest in luxury and material comfort was accompanied by a demand to solve the problems of a disordered world. The sciences were received the major attention of the age were astronomy, mathematics, geography, medicine, and physics. Major Hellenistic sciences and their achievements are sketched below in the summary form. In astronomy, Aristarchus of Samos came up with the heliocentric theory that the planets revolve around the sun. Hipparchus was the invention of the astro and preparation of one of the best charts of the heavens, an approximate correct calculation of the diameter of the moon and its distance from the earth, and the discovery of the precession of the equinoxes, and laid the foundation of both plane and spherical trigonometry. Ptolemy of Alexandria wrote the Almagest, which based on the geocentric theory, which was accepted in medieval times as the classic summary of astronomy. That means all the planets, including the sun, rotated around the earth. Eratosthenes, besides having a huge head, calculated the circumference of the earth, 24,670 miles, with an error of less than 200 miles. He produced accurate maps with the earth divided into degrees of latitude and longitude. He advocated the theory that all oceans are really one, and the first to suggest sailing west to reach India. In the field of mathematics, we have Euclid, who wrote the Elements of Geometry, which was compiling his own and other mathematical works. In physics, Archimedes, he said, "Give me a place to stand on and I will move the world." He came up with a law of specific gravity, formulated the principle of the lever, the pulley, the screw, and invented compound pulley, the tubular screw for pumping water, the screw propeller for ships, and the burning lens. The applied sciences, Hero, or Hieron of Alexandria, invented the fire engine, a siphon, a forge pump, a hydraulic organ, and a slot machine, a catapult operated by compressed air, a thermoscope, and a steam engine, but was more used for a toy. And this is an interesting thing. So if we look at Hieron, almost 200 years before beginning of modern time, came up with a steam engine. But it was never used because the slaves in the Greek system did all the work. But it gives me goosebumps to think about it. If they used a steam engine during the Greek time, and the first practical steam engine that was working came with James Watt in the 1760s. 200 years later, Neil Armstrong is on the moon. Where would we be today in advancement of the world if the Greeks had heavily used the steam engine? In the field of medicine, Herophilus of Chalcedon was the greatest anatomist of antiquity. Galen says he was the first to practice dissection. He gave a detailed description of the brain and the functions of its parts. He discovered significance of the pulse. He discovered that arteries contain blood alone and the function to carry blood from the heart to the body in circulation. Aristostratus was the founder of physiology. He practiced dissection and vivisection. He discovered the valves of the heart and distinguished between motor and sensory nerves. He taught arteries and veins are connected and condemned bloodletting as a cure. He rejected humoral theory of disease. In the school of philosophy, the Hellenic philosophers devoted much speculation on the problem of winning human happiness. Two philosophical schools were to exist a lasting influence: Epicureanism and Stoicism. The Epicureans made the enjoyment of pleasure the key to happiness, although they did not advise the life of wine, women, and song that is today associated with the term Epicurean. Epicurus established his philosophy based on ethics. How is a wise man to conduct his life? This would be the fundamental question. Epicurus established the foundation of his ethical system in a material world which he said was made up of tiny atoms moving through space in accordance with natural law. Although he did not deny the existence of gods, he did declare that they played no part in worldly affairs. Epicurus taught that oracles, omens, and dreams had no significance. Furthermore, he held no high regard for political or social life. The state to him was a mere convenience, and the wise men should not participate in public life. Additionally, for Epicurus and for his disciples, happiness consisted of primarily in freedom from physical pain and worldly care and fears. The wise man recognizes that he cannot eradicate the evils of the world and should thus withdraw to study philosophy, enjoy the fellowship of a few congenial friends, and he ranked friendship first among virtues, and savor the tranquility of mind. A more radical defeatist philosophy was proposed by the skeptics. Skepticism was founded by Pyrrho, a contemporary of Epicurus and Zeno. The chief source of inspiration of the skeptics was that the sophist teaching that all knowledge is derived from the sense perception, therefore must be limited and relative. From this, they deduced the conclusion that we can't prove anything. Since the impression of our senses deceive us, no truth can be certain. We have no definite knowledge of the supernatural or the meaning of life or even of right or wrong. The skeptic's ideal was one of the escape for the individual from the world he could neither understand or reform. The founder of Stoicism was Zeno, who taught that the cosmos was ordered and completely material in which all contradictions are resolved for the ultimate good. Everything that happens is determined in accordance with a rational purpose. Man is not master of his fate and can freely and graciously either accept or reject his fate. The highest good was serenity of mind, with duty and self-discipline as a major virtue. The Stoics did not recommend withdrawing from society, but urged participation as a duty of a rational mind. They condemned war and slavery, and thus been noted for their egalitarianism, pacifism, and humanitarianism. Both Epicureanism and Stoicism were individualistic and concerned with the good of the individual as opposed to the society as a whole. These systems of thought taught that man was part of God or nature, and that goodness was a cooperation with God or nature. In summary, Epicureanism favored solitude, while the Stoics acknowledged the necessity of faith, preached the aesthetic doctrine of simplicity and self-restraint of all things in God. However, Zeno did not accept the particular gods or offer personal immortality, and therefore his teachings are philosophical rather than theological in nature. Nevertheless, Stoicism became a religion during Roman times, which led to the establishment of medieval monasteries and ultimately to Protestant Christianity. Religion in the Hellenistic world. The Greeks of the Hellenistic world were heavily influenced by Eastern mystery cults, especially coming from Egypt. These rites usually included a pilgrimage to the site. Temples were located all throughout the Greek world, and all were very similar in the way the individual could pursue a path to salvation, with a savior god or goddess who had risen from the dead. The cult of Isis was goddess of women, marriage, and children, and the initiated was promised eternal life. Besides the influence of skepticism, another philosophical school influenced Stoicism was Cynicism. This name derived from the gymnasium near Athens called Sigornis. Here Asthenes, a pupil of Socrates, founded the Cynic school and taught philosophy after the death of his master. The Cynics held that virtue, not pleasure, is the supreme of the human life. The virtuous man has few wants and despises the pomp and vanities of the world, its censure and praise. These ideals can lead to excessive, and they did in some of the Cynics, became useful hermits and showed a contempt for art, literature, and everything that defines reason to live. The Jews of the Hellenistic world. Judea, under the rule of the Ptolemies until 200 BC, when it fell under the rule of the Seleucids. Antiochus IV tried to impose moral culture and religious unity in Judea, and he sent troops to Jerusalem and seized the temple dedicated to the worship of Zeus in 168 BC, which sparked an uprising. Judas Maccabus in 164 led zealots in a successful retaking of the temple. His soldiers went to the holy temple and were saddened that many things were missing or broken, including the golden menorah. They cleaned and repaired the temple, and when they were finished, they decided to have a big dedication ceremony. For the celebration, the Maccabees wanted to light the menorah. They looked everywhere for oil and found a small flask that contained only enough oil to light the menorah for one day. Miraculously, the oil lasted for 8 days. This gave them enough time to obtain new oil and keep the menorah lit. This would create Hanukkah, the festival of light. And so this ends our study of the Hellenistic world.